Everyone in town trusted Victor Hale. Firm handshakes, easy smiles, advice freely given. I trusted him once too. But watching how effortlessly people placed their faith in him, something turned cold inside me. The safest faces often know collapse best. That's when it hit me. If my family was breaking, it wouldn't be loud. It would be silent, precise, and hidden in plain sight. The house sat just far enough from the highway that you could hear everything but never quite see it. Trucks passing late at night, tires humming over asphalt. That low, constant sound became the background of our lives, like breathing you didn't notice until it stopped. It was a one-story place, old paint, narrow hallway, the kind of home where every creak had a memory attached to it. I'd lived there most of my adult life with my mom, Mary Ann. People love to ask why. I used to give practical answers: money, timing, family. The truth was quieter than that. Nothing in our house looked violent. There were no holes in the walls, no shouting matches that spilled into the yard. If you walked in on a random afternoon, you'd see a normal scene: dishes drying on the counter, bills stacked neatly by the phone, Victor sitting at the table going through paperwork, glasses low on his nose, like a man taking responsibility seriously. That's the thing people don't understand. When control works, it doesn't look like chaos. It looks like order. Victor made decisions the same way every time. Calm voice, careful words, always ending with the same phrase: "This is what's best for the family." He said it about money, about medical appointments, about paperwork I didn't fully understand but was told not to worry about. And after a while, none of us questioned it out loud. My mom trusted him. Not loudly, not passionately. It was a tired kind of trust. The kind that grows when you're exhausted and someone steps in saying they'll handle things so you don't have to think anymore. Mary Ann had been that way for years. Quiet, agreeable. She didn't argue. She deferred. When Victor spoke, she'd nod first, then look at me almost like she was asking me to nod too. So I did, at least at first. Our family didn't fight. We avoided. Conversations ended early. Questions got redirected. If I asked why a bill had changed or why a prescription looked different, Victor would smile like I'd missed something obvious. "It's taken care of," he'd say, or "You're overthinking it." After a while, I stopped asking, not because I believed him completely, but because every question came with a cost. A sigh, a pause, a subtle shift in the room where I felt like I'd disrupted something fragile. People think manipulation happens fast, like a switch flips. It doesn't. It happens the way rust spreads. Slowly, quietly. You don't notice until something breaks. There's a lie we grow up with, and it sounds logical on the surface. Only children get manipulated. Adults know better. Adults can leave. Adults should see the signs. I believed that too, for a long time. But manipulation doesn't take your intelligence. It takes your confidence in your own judgment. Little by little, I started doubting myself. Not in big dramatic ways, just small ones. I'd think, that seems odd, and then immediately follow it with, but maybe I'm wrong. I'd rehearse questions in my head and decide they sounded silly before I ever said them out loud. That's how it works. You don't wake up controlled. You wake up careful. Age doesn't protect you from that. Neither does education. Neither does independence on paper. Because the fight isn't happening in your resume or your bank account. It's happening in your perception of reality. People love to ask, "Why didn't you just leave?" As if leaving is a single decision you make one afternoon. As if there aren't 1,000 invisible threads tying you to a place. Responsibility, guilt, fear of being wrong. fear of blowing everything up over a feeling you can't quite prove. Every day I asked myself quieter questions instead. What if I'm mistaken? What if I say something and I'm the one who causes damage? What if I break my mother's sense of stability over nothing? Victor counted on that. Not because he knew me so well, but because he knew the pattern. People who want to keep the peace will always hesitate longer than people who want control. The house trained us that way. Silence was rewarded. Compliance made things smoother, and the absence of violence made it easy to believe nothing was truly wrong. But safety isn't the same as freedom, and calm isn't the same as consent. Looking back, I can see it clearly. At the time, all I felt was this constant low-level tension, like standing on a floor that might give way but never quite did. Not yet. I wasn't weak. My mom wasn't stupid. We were navigating something that had been designed to look reasonable from the outside and exhausting from the inside. And the most dangerous part was this. The longer nothing obvious happened, the more convinced everyone became that everything was fine. That's where the story really begins. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part that's hardest to explain. 7 weeks after I first started feeling uneasy, nothing had actually gone wrong. Not in a way you could point to. My mom wasn't in the hospital. No one was yelling. The house still looked the same every morning when I walked into the kitchen. But small things started repeating. The first time, it was paperwork. I was helping Marianne sort through a stack of medical forms that had arrived in the mail. Insurance explanations, appointment summaries, prescription notices, the usual stuff. Except some pages were missing. Not ripped out, just gone. Victor told us he'd already handled them. Said the clinic had made a mistake and resent everything directly to him. His explanation sounded reasonable. It always did. I nodded, even though something in my stomach tightened. A week later, a new envelope came. Same clinic, same return address. Again, the pages that explained billing details weren't there, just the cover letter and a signature page. I remember holding the papers in my hand, counting them twice, then putting them back like the numbers might change if I wasn't looking hard enough. That night, Victor made a phone call from the garage. He always took certain calls out there, said it was quieter, said the reception was better. I didn't think much of it until I realized he lowered his voice only when talking about deliveries, schedules, things that sounded logistical, not emotional, not personal, practical. 3 weeks later, Marianne started taking new supplements. They came in plain packaging, no pharmacy label, just a small white bottle with printed instructions taped to the side. Victor said they were recommended by someone he trusted. Said they'd help with her energy, with inflammation, with sleep. I asked where they came from. He didn't look at me when he answered. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I've already checked." That was the sentence that started to repeat. Every question I asked after that ran into the same wall. Already handled, already checked, already taken care of. He said it calmly, almost kindly, like he was doing me a favor by not involving me. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because the alternative meant accepting something I didn't yet have words for. 2 nights later, I noticed Marianne skipping doses. Not intentionally, she just forgot. Her hands shook when she tried to open the bottle. She complained about headaches she hadn't had before. When I mentioned it, Victor said adjustment periods were normal, said not to scare her with unnecessary concern. He said it in front of her, so I dropped it. That's how these things stay invisible. They're corrected in public and questioned only in private. And eventually, you stop questioning out loud altogether. Another week passed, then another. The calls continued, always short, always quiet, always ending when I walked near the garage door. The paperwork kept arriving incomplete. The supplements kept coming, always delivered when I wasn't home. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it started to feel like a pattern. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not family, because how do you explain something when you don't even trust your own explanation? How do you say, nothing bad is happening, but something feels wrong, without sounding dramatic? I told myself I was being paranoid, tired, overprotective. Victor never slipped. That was the part that bothered me most. He didn't panic, didn't rush, didn't get angry when I asked questions. He smiled, reassured, redirected. People think guilt makes people messy. Sometimes it makes them precise. One afternoon, I found a receipt in the trash. It wasn't crumpled, it wasn't hidden, just folded once, like it had been glanced at and dismissed. A shipping receipt. Not for medication exactly. Something categorized as nutritional compounds. The vendor name meant nothing to me. The address was out of state. I put it back, not because I was scared, because I didn't know what to do with it yet. That night, Marianne fell asleep at the table. Her fork slipped from her hand. Victor laughed it off, said she'd had a long day. I watched her chest rise and fall, slower than usual, and felt that tightening again. I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. Dates, delivery intervals, the timing of Victor's calls lining up perfectly with new bottles appearing in the cabinet. The way he always answered the phone on the third ring, like he'd been expecting it. Still, I had nothing concrete, no proof. Just repetition. And repetition is dangerous because it doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to notice. That's when I realized something else. The reason none of this had raised alarms wasn't because it was normal. It was because Victor controlled the flow of information. What we saw, what we signed, what questions were considered reasonable. He didn't need to hide everything, just enough. I didn't confront him, not then. Instead, I started keeping track, quietly. Dates written in the back of a notebook, delivery times, changes in Marianne's behavior. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building awareness, because patterns don't accuse, they reveal, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. At that point, I still didn't know what I was looking at, only that whatever was happening wasn't random. It was organized, deliberate, and designed to look harmless if you didn't look too closely. I went to bed that night listening to trucks pass on the highway, counting the seconds between the sound and the silence. Nothing had exploded. No one had been exposed, but something had shifted. I stopped asking whether I was imagining things and started asking what would happen if I ignored them. 2 days after I started writing dates in that notebook, I pulled an old cardboard box out from the back of my closet. It was labeled in my handwriting, "School." Inside were things I hadn't touched in years. Spiral notebooks with bent corners, a cheap calculator with a cracked screen, highlighters dried out from being left open, a folder full of printed spreadsheets from a class I barely remembered taking. I sat on the floor with the box open and realized something that made me feel both stupid and relieved. I didn't need a dramatic clue. I needed consistency. Before Marianne and I were living with Victor, I'd been the kind of person who liked numbers because numbers didn't change their tone halfway through a conversation. Numbers didn't punish you for asking questions. They either added up or they didn't. I went to a community college about an hour away, nothing fancy. I worked part-time, took classes in supply chain accounting, logistics, inventory controls. I learned how to track shipments, match invoices, reconcile orders, spot the quiet places where money and product disappear without anyone noticing. I was good at it. Not in a bragging way. In the way where a professor once said, "You see patterns faster than most people." I remember smiling like it didn't matter, like it was just school. Then my mom got sick the first time. Not dangerously sick, just enough that she needed help. I started missing classes. Then I dropped one course, then another, and eventually the whole plan of finishing something for myself faded into the background of taking care of her. I didn't think of that time as something I lost. I thought of it as something I postponed. Victor came into our lives right around then. He didn't show up as a villain. He showed up as a solution. He paid a bill without being asked, fixed the fence, made phone calls my mom was too overwhelmed to make. He'd talk about systems and organization like those were the same thing as love. And when you've been drowning, you don't question the hand that pulls you up. You just grab it. The first time Victor told me I didn't need to worry about paperwork, I believed him, because part of me wanted to believe someone else could carry it. That's the trap right there. Not the fear, the relief. But sitting on the floor with that old box, I felt something wake up in me that had been asleep for a long time. It was the part of me that noticed details. The part of me that could look at a receipt and ask, why this vendor? The part that could hear a phone call and catch a word like freight or drop-off and not let it slide past. I opened a new spreadsheet on my laptop, not because I knew I was building a case, because my brain needed somewhere to put the repetition. I started with what I had, dates from my notebook, the shipping receipt I'd found, the days Marianne seemed worse, the days Victor made calls, the days those plain white bottles appeared like magic in the cabinet. It felt almost ridiculous at first, like I was turning my own life into an accounting assignment. But something happened when I put it all on the screen. It started to line up. Not perfectly, not enough to prove anything, but enough to make me stop second-guessing myself. There's a strange power in seeing your instincts translated into something you can point to. When it's in your head, you can talk yourself out of it. When it's in a table with dates and times, it becomes harder to ignore. I didn't tell Marianne. Not yet. And I know some of you are already thinking, why not? If you've never been in this kind of situation, that question makes perfect sense. But when you live inside a house where one person controls what counts as real, you learn something quickly. If you accuse too early, you don't just lose the argument. You lose access. You lose information. You lose proximity. And the person you're trying to protect ends up even more alone with the person you're trying to expose. Victor underestimated me because I'd been quiet for so long. To him, I was background noise. The adult daughter who lived at home, the one who helped out, the one who didn't have a career worth mentioning, the one who could be redirected with a smile and a dismissive comment. He forgot who I was before I got tired. And that's not an insult. That's how people like him survive. They assign you a role, and as long as you stay inside it, they stop watching you. It's one of the most common mistakes in power dynamics. People assume the person who looks small is harmless. They confuse silence with emptiness. But silence can mean someone is paying attention. I wasn't paying attention because I wanted revenge. I was paying attention because I was afraid. Because Marianne's hands were shaking more often. Because she'd lose her place mid-sentence and look at me like she was embarrassed. Because her skin looked dull, like she hadn't slept in weeks. And every time I tried to bring up a concern, Victor's response was the same. "Don't worry," he'd say. "I've got it." The more he said it, the less comforting it sounded. One afternoon, I stood in the kitchen pretending to rinse a dish while Victor's voice drifted in from the garage. The door was cracked just enough for me to hear fragments. Same address. Drop schedule. Can't have delays. It didn't sound like someone ordering vitamins. It sounded like someone managing a supply chain. My heart started beating faster, not because I had proof, but because I recognized the language. That was the moment my past stopped being something I never finished and became the only tool I had. I began collecting what I could without raising alarms. I took photos of labels when Victor wasn't looking. I saved envelopes. I checked the trash on nights he took it out early. I wrote down return addresses even when they looked harmless. I looked up vendors that sounded generic. I kept everything small enough that it could be explained away if I got caught. And the whole time, I stayed in my role. Quiet, helpful, the daughter who didn't interfere. Because the more invisible you are, the more people show you who they really are. That's what people don't realize. The person who is underestimated has one advantage nobody talks about. They get access, they get time, they get to watch. And once I started watching with the part of my brain that used to balance inventories and track shipments, Victor's random choices stopped looking random. They started looking planned. I still couldn't prove what it meant, but I could feel the direction it was going. And I knew this: if I was right, the next mistake Victor made wouldn't be loud. It would be small. It would be on paper. And I would be ready when it happened. There's a moment I keep replaying in my head. It was late. The house was quiet in that way that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Marianne was asleep in her room. Victor was watching TV, volume low, the glow from the screen cutting across the living room wall. I was standing in the kitchen, holding one of those plain white bottles in my hand. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. What would happen if I yelled right now? What if I walked into that living room, held the bottle up, and said out loud what I was thinking? What if I told my mom I didn't trust what she was taking? What if I accused Victor of something I couldn't yet prove? People imagine that moment like a movie scene, like the truth drops and everything stops. That's not how it works. If I yelled, Victor wouldn't panic. He'd look confused, hurt even. He'd ask what I was talking about. He'd say I was stressed, that I was projecting, that I'd been spending too much time alone with my thoughts. And my mom? She would freeze. Not because she didn't love me, but because fear doesn't always run toward the loudest voice. Sometimes it runs toward the familiar one. If I yelled too soon, Marianne wouldn't feel protected. She'd feel torn. She'd feel like she had to choose between stability and uncertainty. Between the man who handled things and the daughter who was suddenly making everything feel unsafe. I'd seen that look on her face before. The way her shoulders tensed when voices rose. The way she shrank when conflict entered the room. Yelling wouldn't save her. It would isolate her. And that realization scared me more than staying quiet. I know how this sounds. I know some of you are already thinking, if you thought she was in danger, how could you not act immediately? So let me ask you something instead. Imagine you suspect someone is hurting the person you love most, but you don't have test results. You don't have proof. You don't have anyone else in the room who sees what you see. Now imagine that person you suspect is also the one who controls the appointments, the paperwork, the explanations. The one who talks calmly to doctors. The one who knows exactly what to say to sound reasonable. If you confront them too early, they don't stop. They adapt. They hide better. They change routines. They move faster. And suddenly, you're not just worried about harm. You're worried about not being there when it happens. That's the part no one wants to talk about. Acting too soon can make things worse. That night, I stood in the kitchen longer than I should have, staring at that bottle, arguing with myself in silence. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, to interrupt, to force clarity. But another part of me, the one that had been quietly watching patterns, knew something else. This wasn't a situation where noise would bring help. This was a situation where noise would close doors. So I put the bottle back, not because I didn't care, because I cared too much to gamble with the wrong move. I started running scenarios in my head instead. If I told a doctor without evidence, would they listen? Or would they note family tension and move on? If I called someone outside the house, what would they actually be able to do without documentation? I hated that my mind worked this way. I hated that I was thinking strategically instead of emotionally. But emotions don't hold up in systems built on procedure. That's the ugly truth. Systems don't respond to fear. They respond to proof. That realization didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel trapped. Because now I knew what I needed, and I knew how long it might take. Waiting doesn't feel noble when you're inside it. It feels like failure, like you're choosing comfort over courage. But what I was really choosing was timing. I watched Marianne more closely. I made sure she ate. I made excuses to sit with her longer. I offered to drive her places Victor usually handled. Small things, normal things, things that didn't raise suspicion. And every day I asked myself the same question. Is today the day I speak up? And every day the answer was the same. Not yet. Because once you accuse someone like Victor, there's no going back to quiet observation. The room changes, the rules change. And if you're wrong, or just early, you don't get a second chance. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to protect a life. That's the part people miss when they judge silence. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's containment. Sometimes it's the only way to keep a situation from exploding before you're ready to handle the fallout. I didn't need to be right out loud. I needed to be right at the right time. And that meant holding on to a truth I couldn't yet say. Not because I was weak, but because yelling would have felt good for about 10 seconds. And then it would have made everything much, much harder. So I waited. And while I waited, I prepared. Because if I was going to speak, I needed my voice to land somewhere that couldn't be ignored. That moment wasn't here yet, but it was coming. 3 weeks after I asked myself whether to yell, I found the mistake. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a confession or a confrontation. It showed up the way most real problems do, quietly, in something no one thought was worth double-checking. It was a receipt. I was taking the trash out late one night, later than usual because Victor had already gone to bed. I remember the air being cold, the street completely empty, the kind of silence that makes you slow down without realizing it. When I lifted the bag, it felt heavier than it should have. Something inside was folded differently. I tore the bag open just enough to look, telling myself I was being ridiculous. And there it was. A shipping invoice, half crumpled, edges torn like it had been grabbed and thrown away quickly. I stood there under the porch light and read it 3 times. It wasn't addressed to a pharmacy. It wasn't billed through insurance. It listed a distributor I didn't recognize, using a category label that felt intentionally vague. Nutritional compounds, bulk order, recurring shipment. The date caught my eye first, then the quantity, then the return address. I brought it inside and laid it flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the creases like that would make it tell me more than it already had. I pulled out my laptop and typed the company name into the search bar. Nothing. I tried again, adding the state. Still nothing. I searched business registries, shipment databases, even forums where people complain about bad suppliers. That's when I noticed something else. The address wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. 1 digit missing from the zip code. 1 letter off in the street name. Small enough to look like a typo. Big enough to keep it from being easily traceable. My stomach dropped. I went back to my spreadsheet, the one I'd been building quietly for weeks. I entered the date from the invoice, then the quantity, then the distributor name. It wasn't the first time that name had appeared. It was the 4th. That's when the pattern snapped into focus. Every shipment of those supplements followed the same rhythm, 2 to 3 weeks apart, always arriving a day or 2 before Marianne's energy dipped noticeably. always disappearing into the cabinet before I could ask where they came from. And every time, Victor made a call within hours of delivery. Not to a doctor, not to a pharmacy, to someone handling logistics. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, feeling that strange mix of clarity and dread that comes when you finally stop questioning yourself. This wasn't random. It was managed. I thought back to something Victor had mentioned once, early on, before I'd learned to tune out his stories. He talked about a job he used to have, something in medical logistics, inventory, distribution. He'd laughed about it like it was boring, like it didn't matter. But it mattered, because it meant he knew the gaps. He knew how shipments were tracked. He knew which products required oversight and which ones slipped through under the right labels. He knew how easy it was to move something questionable through a system built on volume and assumption. I wasn't looking at a sloppy mistake. I was looking at someone who understood exactly how much they could get away with. I pulled every invoice I could find from the last 3 months. Most of them were clean, normal, bills, groceries, household supplies. And then there were the outliers, the ones with slightly different formatting, the ones with vendors that didn't exist anywhere else. Each one by itself meant nothing. Together, they told a story. And the story wasn't about supplements. It was about control. I checked the payment method listed on the invoices. Not insurance, not a standard account. A secondary payment source Victor had set up quietly, separate from the main household expenses. Small enough amounts to avoid attention, regular enough to maintain supply. My hands were shaking by the time I finished lining everything up. Not because I was panicking, because I finally understood the scale. Victor hadn't just stepped into our lives and taken over out of convenience. He'd built a system around us, one where he controlled what came in, what went out, and what questions ever reached the surface. And Marianne? She trusted him because everything looked orderly, because nothing ever felt urgent enough to challenge. I sat at that kitchen table until the sky started to lighten, replaying every interaction through this new lens, every calm reassurance, every gentle dismissal, every time he'd said, "I've got it," and I'd let him. This wasn't a man acting impulsively. This was a man executing a plan. The most terrifying part wasn't that he was careful. It was that he was consistent. I took photos of every invoice, saved copies in multiple places, backed them up somewhere Victor would never think to look. I didn't confront him. I didn't change my behavior. I stayed exactly the same, because now I knew something important. The next mistake wouldn't be emotional. It would be procedural. People like Victor don't slip when they're angry. They slip when they're confident, when they believe the system is working in their favor and stop checking their own work as closely. I closed my laptop and stood in the quiet kitchen, listening to the house wake up around me. Marianne's door creaked open down the hall. Victor's footsteps followed a few minutes later, steady and unhurried. He smiled at me like always, asked if I'd slept well. I smiled back, because at that point, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was documenting. And once something is documented, it doesn't disappear just because someone wants it to. The small, forgettable invoice hadn't exposed everything, but it had done something far more important. It had proven I wasn't imagining it, and it meant the end of this story would be written on paper, not shouted in a room. All I had to do now was wait for the right page to turn. 7 weeks after I found the invoice, the house felt different. Nothing had changed on the surface. Victor still made coffee in the morning. Marianne still folded laundry by the window in the afternoon. The television still played softly at night, like background noise meant to fill the space where questions might otherwise live. But I knew something Victor didn't. The system was already moving. I didn't walk into a police station waving papers. I didn't accuse him across the kitchen table. I did what systems understand best. I documented. I submitted. I waited. The first call didn't come to our house. It went to a distributor. Someone asked questions that weren't accusatory, just precise. Dates, quantities, authorization. The kind of questions that sound harmless until you can't answer them cleanly. The second call went to a clinic that had unknowingly been listed as a point of reference. They pulled records, not because they suspected a crime, but because a discrepancy had appeared. That's how it always starts, not with outrage, with inconsistency. 3 days later, a letter arrived addressed to Victor. Official, neutral, no threats. Just a request for clarification regarding supply authorization and chain of custody documentation. I watched his hands when he opened it. They didn't shake, but they slowed down. He read it twice, folded it carefully, put it on the counter like it might bite him if he moved too fast. That night, he made 3 phone calls instead of 1. The next week, the deliveries stopped. Not because he chose to stop them, because someone else had paused them. A hold had been placed. Temporary, pending review. Victor told Marianne it was a shipping delay. He said things were backed up. He said it happened all the time. His voice was calm, practiced, but something was missing. Confidence. When systems step in, they don't announce themselves with sirens. They apply pressure quietly, in places the person in control expects to be solid. Paperwork started coming in that Victor didn't control. Emails he couldn't reroute. Requests he couldn't dismiss with a smile. One afternoon, 2 people knocked on the door. They weren't there to arrest anyone. They didn't raise their voices. They introduced themselves politely and asked to speak with Victor about logistics authorizations connected to third-party medical supplies. Marianne offered them coffee. Victor declined. I watched from the hallway as he answered their questions. He did well at first. He always did. He spoke clearly, explained processes, provided partial records. Then they asked him for a specific document, the one he didn't have. The one that proved consent, oversight, and legitimacy all at once. He said he'd retrieve it. They said they'd wait. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. Control isn't lost when someone is accused. It's lost when someone else starts asking for proof. Within days, access was restricted. Accounts were frozen pending verification. Authority Victor had exercised quietly for months was no longer his to wield. No one yelled. No one accused him of anything out loud. They just took his permissions away. Marianne didn't understand at first. She was confused, frustrated. She asked Victor why everything suddenly felt complicated, why appointments needed rescheduling, why paperwork she'd never seen before needed her signature. For the first time, Victor didn't have immediate answers. He told her it was temporary. He said it would pass. But systems don't reverse themselves because someone wants them to. I remember the exact moment it became real for him. He tried to authorize a shipment over the phone, the way he always had. I could hear his voice from the kitchen, calm, certain. There was a pause, then another. Then his tone changed. Not panicked, just smaller. He hung up without saying goodbye. That night, he sat at the table longer than usual, staring at nothing. Marianne went to bed early. She looked tired, but something else was there too. Awareness. The next morning, I drove her to an appointment myself. Not because Victor asked me to, because the system had removed his access. Sitting in that waiting room, watching her fill out forms in her own handwriting, I felt something loosen inside my chest for the first time in months. Not victory, relief. The investigation didn't explode our lives all at once. It dismantled Victor's control piece by piece. Every week, something else he'd managed quietly was no longer his to manage. Warehousing permissions revoked, third-party accounts reassigned, authorizations expired and not renewed. No drama, just process. Victor tried to adapt. He always did. But you can't outmaneuver a system once you're no longer inside it. You can only react, and reacting was never his strength. Marianne started asking questions, not loud ones, careful ones, the kind that come when someone realizes they've been shielded from information for a long time. Victor didn't yell, he withdrew. The man who once controlled every detail now waited for responses he couldn't influence. That's what justice looked like in our house. Not handcuffs, not shouting, just the quiet return of choice. One evening, as I watched Marianne sort her medications at the table, real ones, verified ones, she looked up at me and said, "Things feel different." I nodded. They were. Victor was still there, still breathing, still speaking, but the center of gravity had moved, and once control leaves someone's hands, it doesn't come back easily. The system didn't punish him out of anger, it corrected him out of necessity, and that correction changed everything. Because for the first time since Victor entered our lives, the future was no longer something he could organize behind closed doors. It belonged to the process now, and the process, unlike people, doesn't forget what it's seen. 2 weeks after the system started stripping Victor's access, Marianne did something I hadn't seen her do in a long time. She went into the kitchen, opened the drawer where we kept the pens, and pulled out a notebook of her own. Not mine, not Victor's. Hers. She sat at the table, the same table where Victor used to spread out paperwork like it belonged to him, and she started writing down questions. Small questions at first. What is this appointment for? Why did they change the dosage? Who signed this? I watched her hand move slowly across the page, like she was learning how to take up space again. And that's when I realized the biggest thing Victor had taken from us wasn't money or paperwork or even peace. It was permission. Permission to ask. Permission to doubt. Permission to decide. People have this harsh way of talking about adults who still live at home, like it's automatically a failure. Like the moment you turn a certain age, your zip code becomes your identity. But life isn't that clean. Some people stay because their parents are aging. Some people stay because rent isn't survivable anymore. Some people stay because they're trying to hold a family together with 2 hands and a tired heart. Staying isn't the problem. The problem is staying in a place where you don't have a vote. In our house, Victor didn't need to lock doors. He didn't need to scream to be in charge. He just needed to make it feel like every decision was too complicated for us to touch. He made himself the translator of our lives. If Marianne had a symptom, he explained it. If a bill arrived, he handled it. If a form needed signing, he guided her hand. And because it looked like help, no one called it what it was: control. That's why people outside the situation get confused. They don't see bruises, they don't hear shouting, so they assume it's fine. But I learned something in those months that I wish someone had said out loud sooner. A quiet house can still be a cage. Not the kind with bars, the kind with routines. The kind where you wake up every day and you don't argue because arguing feels like cruelty. You don't question because questioning feels like betrayal. You don't push back because pushing back feels like you're breaking something fragile. And when you've lived like that long enough, you stop noticing you're shrinking. Marianne didn't shrink overnight. She practiced it. 3 years of stepping back when Victor stepped forward. 3 years of nodding first so she didn't have to deal with the consequences of disagreeing. 3 years of letting "I've got it" replace "what do you think?" It doesn't take an unintelligent person to fall into that. It takes a tired one. The day Victor lost access to those accounts, it wasn't just a logistical change. It was the first time the house was forced to operate without him translating everything. Suddenly, Marianne had to hear things directly from clinics. She had to sign her own forms. She had to ask what medications were for. And when she asked, people answered. That's what shook her. Not that the answers were scary, that the answers existed the whole time. I think a lot of people believe the truth wins automatically if you're right. Like, the world has a built-in fairness setting that activates when you've suffered enough. It doesn't. Being right is not a strategy. Being right is a feeling. Systems don't run on feelings. They run on documentation, procedures, thresholds, and timelines. That's why Victor stayed calm for so long. He wasn't relying on love or trust. He was relying on the fact that no one could challenge him without proof. That's what made this so painful. Marianne could have felt uneasy for years, and it would have meant nothing in a room full of paperwork controlled by someone else. I could have been angry. I could have screamed. I could have been absolutely morally correct. And without the system moving, it still would have been our word against his. That's the difference between knowing something is wrong and being able to stop it. You need a process. You need a record. You need a place for your truth to land that isn't just the air in your kitchen. Once Marianne started asking questions, she started remembering things she'd buried. Moments where she'd felt small and told herself it was normal. Moments where she'd felt confused and told herself she was lucky someone else understood. Moments where she'd signed something without reading because Victor was impatient and she didn't want to start an argument. Watching her sit at that table with her notebook, I felt something complicated. Relief, yes, but also grief. Because it shouldn't have taken an investigation for her to feel allowed to ask what was happening to her own body. That's what control does. It doesn't just manage your schedule. It reshapes your self-respect. One afternoon, we drove to a follow-up appointment together. No Victor, no interruptions. No, I'll handle it. Marianne held her own folder, her own insurance card, her own pen. In the waiting room, she leaned toward me and whispered, "I feel silly." I asked her why. She said, "I don't know how to do this without him." And that sentence hit me harder than anything else, because it wasn't true. She did know how. She'd just been trained not to. I told her, "You're not silly. You're just out of practice." She nodded, but her eyes got wet anyway. That's when I understood something that's hard to say out loud. Sometimes the trap isn't the house. It's the role you're forced to play inside it. The good wife, the grateful partner, the easy person, the one who doesn't make trouble, the one who lets someone else lead because it feels safer than leading yourself. And if that's you watching this, if you've ever stayed somewhere because responsibility pulled you there, hear me clearly. Staying does not make you weak. Staying does not make you a failure. But if you're staying somewhere that requires you to stop asking questions to keep the peace, that's not peace, that's management. And if you're staying somewhere where you don't have a say in your own life, that's not family. That's a structure built around your silence. Marianne didn't need a new house to start healing. She needed ownership of her body, of her choices, of her voice. And the moment she picked up that notebook and started writing her questions down, I saw the real beginning of our new life. Not when Victor lost control, when Marianne took it back. By the time everything settled, there was no single moment I could point to and say, "This is where we won." There was no courtroom speech, no dramatic apology, no final argument that ended with someone storming out. What there was instead was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels different from silence, not tense, not afraid, just open. Marianne started sleeping through the night again, not perfectly, but without waking up disoriented. She began setting her own reminders, making her own calls, asking questions without looking over her shoulder first. Victor didn't disappear overnight. People like him rarely do. But his presence changed. He stopped directing and started reacting. He waited for responses instead of issuing instructions. And that shift mattered more than any punishment ever could. Looking back, I understand something now that I didn't then. No one in this story won because they were louder. I didn't win because I yelled the truth at the right moment. Marianne didn't win because she finally stood up and confronted someone. Victor didn't lose because someone exposed him emotionally. What changed everything was something far less satisfying to watch. Understanding. Understanding how the system worked. Understanding where control actually lived. Understanding that being morally right means nothing if you don't know where to place that truth so it can't be ignored. For a long time, I thought strength looked like confrontation, like bravery meant calling things out the moment you saw them. But that idea comes from stories that end quickly. Real life doesn't. In real life, the people who survive aren't always the ones who shout first. They're the ones who know when to speak, where to speak, and what language the system actually listens to. I didn't outmuscle Victor. I didn't outshout him. I outlasted him by paying attention, by noticing patterns, by documenting instead of exploding, by choosing timing over relief. And I want to be clear about something, especially if you're watching this and seeing yourself in parts of it. This isn't a story about being patient forever. It's not a story about staying quiet no matter what. It's not advice to endure harm and call it strategy. It's about knowing the difference between acting and reacting, between noise and leverage. There are moments when yelling is necessary, when walking away is the only option, when safety requires immediate movement, not careful planning. But there are also moments, dangerous, complicated ones, where yelling feels right and does absolutely nothing, where anger makes you feel powerful for 10 seconds and powerless for 10 years. If I had acted on instinct alone, Victor would have adapted. If I had relied on being right, nothing would have changed. If I had confused emotion with impact, Marianne would still be waiting for permission. What saved us wasn't rage. It was clarity. Clarity about what mattered. Clarity about where to apply pressure. Clarity about the fact that systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to records. And once I understood that, the story stopped being about him. It became about us. About Marianne learning that she didn't need someone to translate her life anymore. About me realizing that the skills I thought I'd wasted were exactly what we needed. About the quiet return of choice. That's the part I hope you take with you. Not that you should fight smarter than the person hurting you. Not that you should wait endlessly for the perfect moment. But that power doesn't always look the way movies tell us it does. Sometimes it looks like a notebook. Sometimes it looks like a spreadsheet. Sometimes it looks like waiting long enough to speak in a place where your words can't be dismissed. So if you're in a situation right now where someone else always seems to hold the cards, at home, at work, in a relationship, I want to ask you one question. Not how do I confront them, but where does the system actually decide what matters? Because the moment you understand that, you stop shouting into the wrong room, and you start putting your truth somewhere it can't be ignored. If this story made you pause, if it gave language to something you felt but couldn't quite explain, take a second to sit with that. You don't need to have all the answers today. You don't need to make a dramatic move tonight. But you do deserve to know where you stand. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet power, about timing, about surviving without becoming someone you don't recognize, then stay here. Like the video if it resonated with you. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe to the channel if you want to keep exploring the kind of strength that doesn't shout but lasts. Because in the end, no one wins by being louder. The ones who survive are the ones who understand the rules and choose exactly when to play.